So everyone, welcome to our Spring 2023 series on entrepreneurship in Asian high-tech industries. I'm Richard Dasher, and I will be the instructor for this course because it's available to Stanford students for credit, and it's also available to the general public either here or by Zoom. And we will put the videos of each session up on YouTube within a few days of the sessions. What we're really trying to do with this series is to share the most recent information we can about trends in entrepreneurship and also the supporting ecosystems for entrepreneurship in major Asia economies. The series is presented by the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center, which is an industry-funded research center under Stanford Global Studies. And you'll see or you saw, those of you who are in the room before we started, the list of our 16-member companies right now. So we want to say thank you to them for allowing this series to happen. And also want to encourage everybody who's here in person to stay around for some light refreshments after we finish this afternoon. Look forward to talking with you. We'll be going every Tuesday from 4:30 from now until May the 30th. May 33rd, how interesting. I really got to watch my copywriting, right? And you can find out about our upcoming schedule by looking at our website. That one's correct. That one's not a mistake. And I explained about the format just now. I do have a couple of slides that I need to show for students who are registering for credit. So you have three choices to register. Either the primary listing, which is in electrical engineering, or the secondary listings in East Asian studies or East Asia languages and cultures. Be sure and get a copy of the syllabus. That is my formal agreement with you about what I expect from your participation in the course. There are basically two items that you need to do in order to get credit for the course. One is to attend regularly in person. The second point is to send me a weekly email about the content of the session. And if for some reason you can't be here in person, so you have another class at this time, or you're on a Stanford sports team or something, send me an email and we'll work out an accommodation, okay? So any kind of comments, requests, questions, complaints, whatever, you can send to me at rdasher@stanford.edu, but also CC Brianna. Brianna is going to be taking care of the course attendance this quarter, and she works with us as our marketing manager in her real job. The weekly comments, you need to send to us within 2 weeks of the date of the session. Only send one comment per email, only comment on one session at the time. It's about 60 to 90 words. And basically, this is a chance for you to think back on the session and say, what did I really get from it? So really tell us something that you got from the session. It doesn't have to be a comprehensive summary of the entire session. But it should be something that you can't get just by looking at one of the slides, which will be posted on our website. So, you know, summaries of slide decks are not going to be acceptable as comments. I have official university policy now that says that generative AI is not acceptable because it's equivalent to getting help from another person, which is, I think, really complimentary of ChatGPT. But in any case, if you do send in something and I send you a note back saying, I will tell you what you need to do to make it an acceptable comment, so just let me know. Are there any questions from anybody who is planning to take this for credit? Anything about that business side of the course? You can always send me an email later too. Okay, let's move on. Today, start talking about the context of entrepreneurship in Asia this year, and then we'll talk about what's going on in entrepreneurial activity and also attitudes in major Asia economies. Then we'll look at the supporting ecosystem trends. in East Asia, mostly East Asia, a little bit of India too. And hopefully we'll have some time for discussion at the end of this. So, big news, inflation, right? It's very slow to subside. If you look at the table on the top right, you see that just as we thought we were getting out of COVID and everything was coming back to make up for lost time, sure enough, it made up a little too much for lost time. Global inflation was 8.8%. Now that's supposed to go down to 6.6% this year and maybe even 4.3% by 2 years from now, but that's still higher than the level it was for the 3-year period before COVID. So we have that kind of an issue to deal with. We have a lot of geopolitical tension. What's happening with the war in Ukraine? That has an economic impact, not only now, but when the war finally stops. Imagine the rebuilding costs for basically a late stage, almost advanced economy. Ukraine was not a developing economy, and recent wars in the last 40 years have all been in developing economies. So that's going to be a huge cost. The US-China friction keeps getting tighter and tighter, and the recovery from COVID, every other week we seem to get another announcement of another variant, right? So what does all of this stuff do? It increases uncertainty. Of course, inflation, the government actions to stop inflation slow down the economy, but it's not just a slow economy, it's an uncertain economy. We don't know if we're going to go into recession. We don't know if stock prices are going to fall off the earth. We have a lot of controversy going on in society. There is a lot of anti-globalist sentiment in the world, as well as people trying to keep going on. There's a lot of bad feeling about the giant IT firms. Whether or not it's justified, we don't need to get into. The point is that all of this makes it a difficult economy. Add to this, we're in the middle of one of the world's history's great industrial revolutions. Ever since 1950, digital technologies have been spreading more and more. And so now in the era of cloud computing, we are surrounded. We are all interconnected by digital technology, and digital data is being collected everywhere. The fourth industrial revolution is all about the new tools that people are using to analyze what kind of digital data they have. So all of these are fundamentally changing the way we do things. This is the first year I ever had to have a disclaimer about not using ChatGPT, right? It's also only in recent years that we've been able to have this kind of hybrid format with Zoom and in-person attendance here. That got us through COVID, but it's a big change. So in these times of uncertainty, what happens? Investment money slows down to a trickle. The last time we really saw venture investment money slow down at the pace it's slowing down was right after the 2008 financial shock. So what we've got, you can see that throughout 2021, everybody thought things were going to be great, right? Everyone is seeing we're getting out of COVID and so forth, and then inflation and all of this other stuff kind of takes up people's minds. And throughout 2022, venture investment, this is mostly VC, but angel investment and also a little bit of private equity investment, has been dropping like a rock. In Asia, it's tracking that. Notice that the year-on-year change between Q1 of 2022, that arrow's kind of going in the wrong place, and Q1 of 2023 is minus 57%. So this is a major kind of thing. If the investment money slows down, entrepreneurs find it harder to raise funds, right? Just for your interest, This is what's going on in the countries that have the individual countries that have kind of the most venture investing going on. China went from 13.1 billion to 8.1 billion. India from 9.8 billion to 2.4 billion. Israel from 2.9 billion to 1.0 billion. So all of this is just indicating that it's really hard to get the investors to part with their money. But at the same time, interestingly enough, Asia is still kind of the driver of world economic growth. This is from the International Monetary Fund, which publishes a quarterly World Economic Outlook. Notice that China, India, and emerging and developing Asia, which is mostly Southeast Asia, all have higher predicted growth rates than the world growth rate, whereas the advanced economies are considerably slower. So the driving thing that's going on is happening in Asia, especially developing Asia. Why? Why are people able to produce more and consume more? Lifestyles are changing all over Asia, right? You have a new middle class that's still feeling its way around in most Asian countries. And that is a major impact. The other thing that a lot of people are not aware of is that 3 of the world's 5 biggest economies are in Asia. China, at purchase power parity, China is the biggest economy in the world. The US comes in at number 2, then India and Japan. Anybody know who's number 5? California. Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, we would be, but we haven't been able to be liberated yet. So, Germany. So, in any case, Asia is a powerhouse, which means that the investors are looking more at Asia. Asia actually, in terms of the number of deals done, early, mid, and late stage venture, the Asia share is larger than either the North America share or the European share. So Asia is really an important powerhouse for how this entrepreneurial ecosystems of the world are going to go forward. So what's going on? The other kind of thing, and this is going to be one of our big themes this quarter, is that it used to be Asia was a collection of completely self-contained economies that had only limited trade back and forth with each other. Now, even in the entrepreneurial ecosystems, you're seeing much more international activity. Part of this is people can. Now we have a world of cloud computing, right? We have internationally available resources for doing big data analysis. The more data you have, the better. So there's motivation to try to get data from multiple countries. Finally, we can travel again, right? After 3 years of basically being stuck here in California, now I'm starting to travel back to Asia. And I think that you're seeing a lot more international deal sourcing by the big venture capital companies. I've got a slide on that right next. But those are enabling factors. The driving factors behind greater international activity is that, like good entrepreneurs everywhere, they turn problems into opportunities. And the big problems we have, climate tech, food safety, that kind of thing, sustainability, are world problems. So it makes sense for entrepreneurs to be looking for something for the world. And the other point that's kind of the dark side of this is that if it's harder to get money from the investors, you have to tell the investors you have a bigger opportunity. Most of the time, the investors are not going to be satisfied with one country's worth of opportunity, even if it's a big economy. Even China is starting to show the need for international expansion by startup companies, partly because the domestic market is, even though it's huge, it is finite, and for risk hedging. Basically, hedging against political risk as well as other kinds of risk, you want to be in multiple places. So one of the things that we're going to see week after week are people being active internationally. Next week, we have Dr. Andy Zhang, who has a company with a data platform for smart cities. Started in Chengdu, China, and now he has an operation, a company in Singapore that's doing the worldwide expansion for them. In 2 weeks, Peng Ong, who is a venture capitalist, always focused in Southeast Asia. His VC fund is located in Jakarta, but they've been investing all over Southeast Asia for a long time. I've got a panel from Korea coming up in early April, and then a panel from the Philippines is coming here on May the 9th. And then on May 16th, we have Mr. Changhwan Lee, who has been taking ideas across the borders in Asia for some time as well. So that's what's coming up. This is going to be one of the big themes this quarter. Big problems. The sustainability markets in Asia, according to McKinsey, account for almost $5 trillion. Remember that the total size of the American economy was something around 22 or 23 trillion. So this amounts to 1/4 or 1/5 of the size of the American economy. This is the kind of opportunities that start to make investors take notice, right? These are some of the US venture investors that are active in the Asia Pacific. Notice how both in Q1 of 22 and in Q2 of 22, out of the top 10, there were a number of US firms in both times. So this just shows how Silicon Valley is watching Asia for opportunities. So that's kind of the general context. Getting more into patterns about what entrepreneurs are doing in Asia is what we'll talk about next. First, are there any kind of questions, any points that you would like to ask more about this general context? Okay, I'll take that as permission to go forward. So I want to introduce some data from something called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is a very large survey conducted almost every year, led by Babson College and 3 or 4 other universities worldwide. I'm going to look at their adult population survey, where they survey a minimum of 2,000 people in each economy, and they typically look at 50 or 60 different countries. I'm not using their national expert survey. You're welcome to look at it if you're interested. But the great thing about Global Entrepreneurship Monitor is they've been collecting this data ever since 1999. That means that they have a great online database that will tell you things like how many people are acting as entrepreneurs from the working age of the population. So their definition of an active entrepreneur is someone who is either starting a company right now, or they are managing a company that has paid salaries for less than 3.5 years. Notice that what this does is it allows them to avoid the whole distinction between high growth, technology focused startups and lower growth startups like restaurants and traditional things that will never really grow that big. So they have done this so that they don't have to get into a subjective assessment about what's a startup versus what's an SME, right? Small and medium-sized enterprise. But having done this, this is what they find. Notice that they couldn't do their survey in 2021, but in this chart, the striking thing, look what happened to American entrepreneurial This is the percentage of working age adults, 18 to 64 years old, who are fitting in their definition of entrepreneur, right? Either starting a company or running a company for less than 3.5 years. So it's up to almost 20% of the population. That's the highest I've ever seen. And it usually was only places like China in 2011 when there was a mass kind of entrepreneurship program announced by the Chinese government that you would get things higher than that. So in this chart, the other thing that you notice is that since 2012, largely Chinese entrepreneurship has been dropping pretty steadily down to 6% of the working population in 2022. India has kind of sort of been tracking the US, although when you see a lot of variability year to year, one of the things that that tells you is that the economy is in some kind of transition. It means that the people that they happen to get, their 2,000 people, may have been a rather different kind of demographic than the 2,000 people that they got the previous year. Japan has also gradually increased. It doesn't go up and down very much, but increased from about 4.3% to even higher than China now. Wow. No one would have expected that. 6.4% of the working age population in Japan are classed as active entrepreneurs by GEM. If you go on and look at the tigers have always typically had entrepreneurship rates lower than that in the United States. They're high prestige countries, right? They want people to go to work for banks and the government and things like that. So most of the time, you really see things that are not too different from the US line, but a little bit lower than the US line. Taiwan has also dropped, like China, so that now Taiwan is 5.6%. I don't really know if that's concern about geopolitics or what's going on there. Going on from the tigers, actually, one thing that's interesting in South Korea is that they measure the fear of failure. I didn't put a slide together this year, but the fear of failure in most Asian economies tends to be around 50%. 50% of the respondents say that they're afraid of failing, and that's why they're not going to start a company. The fear of failure in Korea is dropped down to like 13%. And it's very different from other places. And I almost wonder if this is kind of Squid Games mentality. If you figure that life is going to be bad to you anyway, what the heck? So, you're seeing different things like that behind the numbers. Asia developing economies are all over the chart. Typically, they have a higher entrepreneurship rate, T rate, than the United States does. With Malaysia being kind of an unusual exception, that may have had to do with political instability for a while. But when you see large jumps, you're seeing economies in transition. So that's what the entrepreneurship rate kind of looks like across Asia right now, how many people are being entrepreneurs. The one question this can't answer, though, is who's being an entrepreneur? Is this really something that people are being an entrepreneur because they're really qualified? They do distinguish between entrepreneurship of necessity and entrepreneurship of opportunity. Most people in Asia say that they're going after opportunities. But when you're looking purely at quantitative data, you're missing the qualitative thing about what are the backgrounds of the people who are going into entrepreneurship. One thing I did want to show is the entrepreneurship rates divided up by gender. I was really surprised by Indonesia and India, where in Indonesia, more women are becoming entrepreneurs than are men. And in India, it's almost equal. The US and China and Taiwan kind of, okay, it's a little bit fewer among the women, and it gets really, unbalanced when you look at Taiwan and especially South Korea and Japan. Way too few women compared to the number of men who are going into the entrepreneurial occasion. And I don't have an explanation for this at this point. This is something to watch. It would be interesting to find out what's going on. But one thing that it is important to note is that there is a big difference between a traditional small and medium-sized enterprise. Somebody starts a corner store. Somebody starts a restaurant. Somebody starts a laundry. And a Silicon Valley style startup where you're expecting very high growth. The other thing you're expecting is exit, meaning that at some point you build up the company enough that either you take it public on the public stock exchange or you sell it to an even bigger company and make a lot of money. There are some kind of intermediate models of growth. I think that it's very worthwhile to look at entrepreneurship in Europe. We're looking at Asia in this course, but you have European companies that aim for longer term, more organic growth, and they may stay as family companies, but they can be successful for a very long time. Other kind of companies that tend to not grow like we expect in Silicon Valley are companies that fulfill just some supply chain niche. And that's very common creation type in places like Japan and Korea, where somebody sees an opportunity to sell into one of the big corporate groups or multiple big corporate groups, but they never can leave that position. So as we talked about with the ACES summit delegates just yesterday, you've got to define your own personal goals. Is your goal to change the world, to bring great value to the world, or just make a lot of money? In general, if you're just aiming to make a lot of money, you should probably do something different. They say real estate investment is usually a better bet, and it's not as hard work. So this is the Silicon Valley model of a startup. You're growing as fast as you can for as long as you can. The typical Silicon Valley rate is aiming at about 100% growth every year. And the hyper successful companies in Silicon Valley sustain that for between 5 and 10 years of steady growth. So in this process, you need a lot of upfront money. You're always hiring more people in order to expand the company. You always need more manufacturing capacity to deliver more goods. So you need upfront money. And this means that gradually you're selling off stock through a number of rounds of investment, so that in the United States, 90% of successful exits are selling the whole company to some big giant firm. And 10% of exits are through going IPO on the public stock exchange. By that point, the original founders of the company typically have less than 25% of the company stock. So by the time you exit, it's already somebody else's company. And this is often a shock to people. Here's a good example of how that Silicon Valley model works. This is Square, now known as Block. So it was founded in 2009. You see its fundraising track record. And when it went IPO in 2015, it IPO'd at $9 a share, which meant that Series D and Series E investors lost money. Series A through C did very well because they paid less for their stock. But what's really interesting is that Square now, just this morning, was $66 a share. So that most of its really incredible growth has come from the public time of the company post-exit. That's something worth remembering because you don't want to just take a company to exit and then forget about it. You really want to leave something that has sustained way of creating value. So that's kind of where we are with the entrepreneurship activity side and what happens with entrepreneurs. If we look at the ecosystems, we're looking at three things. We're looking at the movement of people into startups and to support startups. We're looking at the flow of knowledge, whether that's IP from someplace that's doing R&D into a startup company or business knowledge. And we're also looking at the flow of capital. So if we start with the people side, all three of these, notice that the needs of a startup company change depending on the stage of existence, the stage of growth of the startup. This means that, without entrepreneurs in the population, you're not going to have people starting companies. You need potential entrepreneurs, right, who are willing to start up a company at this stage. Governments have really focused a lot on that problem. But on the people side, what you really need is people who will go to work in somebody else's startup company, who are good, who can deal with the chaos of a startup company, who have great courage, and who are willing to share the vision of the entrepreneurship. You also need a good labor market for these people once the companies go exit. Once a company exits, most of the founders of the company are not going to stay with it. Most of them are going to go on and do something else. So for an ecosystem, whether it's a national economy or a local economy, you really need good opportunities for these people. Same thing about knowledge. Not only do you need access to intellectual property, design thinking is a very important kind of mechanism for flow of knowledge into a startup. You also need just plain and simple business knowledge. How does a company work? What are kind of general accounting principles that if I'm not a specialist accountant, do I need to know? At the growth stage, a company really needs to be focused on things like lean startup principles. How do you maximize the growth while minimizing the cash outflow? Rapid prototyping and increasingly investor relations becomes a critical kind of knowledge for the people in the startup company to have. At this stage, post-exit, it's really important for the startup company idea not to be killed by exit. If a company goes public on the public exchange or it's bought by a big company and its entire vision is taken away, all that lasts is the IP, then that's typically not a successful end to the company. Capital. Everywhere in the world, you start with friend and family money. Angel funds is an important aspect of an ecosystem. Venture capital really kicks in after somebody else has already started to invest money in the company. And then, what are the possibilities for M&A or IPO? Infrastructure is also important, right? You've got both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, and that changes. The needs for a region, an ecosystem, will change depending on how much the startup companies are growing. So in Asia, you do have entrepreneurs everywhere, even in places like Japan, which have traditionally had a very low entrepreneurship rate. There have always been entrepreneurs. But I think that the people problem is the mid to late stage of startup company growth that are the real challenges in Asia. Who wants to go to work for somebody else's company if it's not already prestigious, if it's not already something that is just, your parents will be happy about? That is an issue. And I think that there's a shortage of top quality people who you can get to go to work in a place like that. I had an entrepreneur tell me that he knew he would have to deal with B-level employees. And so he had to work his whole technology development scheme out so that B-level people could do it, because the A-level people were all going off to some, giant like Google. It's also true that in Asia, the incentivization is not as sophisticated as it is here in Silicon Valley. I mean, it's not just pretty rich pay, and the average pay scale in Silicon Valley is considerably higher than other places because the expenses are so high here, or stock options. I think that what it is the culture that you build up. How do you treat your employees? Are they really team members, or are they people who work for you? That kind of team attitude is really coming along in Asia. And I'm hearing, in putting together this series, talking to different people in all of these different ecosystems, including some of the people who will come up as speakers, I'm hearing that the attitudes among teams are really becoming much more open than they used to be. Despite the fact that there is still kind of a social stigma in a lot of places. I remember a venture capitalist from India in this series a few years ago, this is some years ago now, said that her hardest job was convincing parents to let their children go to work in the company that she wanted to give money to. That was her biggest issue. But what I'm seeing in the GEM data that we didn't really take the time to put together slides on this is that the percentage of working age adults who are not currently entrepreneurs, but who see good opportunities for starting a company in their area, in their region, is up around 75 or 80% now. It used to be America outdid everybody with a belief in around 50 or 60% of non-entrepreneurs would see good opportunities for starting a company. Now America's up at 70 or 80%, but so are the major Asia economies. That was a real shock to me, but it's a pleasant shock, right? Another problem with labor in some economies is the lack of mobility. If you do try starting a company and it doesn't go well, will somebody pick you up at an even better salary? Or is your failure going to follow you around for the rest of your career? That kind of issue has been difficult in some Asian countries. And another trend that slows down the movement of people is entrepreneurs tend to stay with their companies more in Asia. I see, especially in Japan and Korea, companies that exit, the entrepreneur stays CEO, and not only stays CEO, but has a very large percentage of the shares of stock in the company. That kind of thing couldn't happen here. The investors wouldn't let people get away with it. And actually, what it does is kind of an economic principle of efficient allocation of resources, where the people who are good at entrepreneurship leave the companies after they get big and they start their second companies, become serial entrepreneurs. And I am starting to see more serial entrepreneurs across Asia. One of the reasons you see an increase in angel funding is because the successful serial entrepreneur numbers are increasing. So that's the people side. On the idea knowledge flow, every country in Asia has some sort of a, new program, an innovation program, where they're really pushing the universities and the research institutions to do more commercialization by means of startup company creation. So the technology transfer is really moving. There's not enough attention in these government programs to the flow of business knowledge. They're starting to do things like mentorship. They're starting to do things like try to have these entrepreneurs, kind of be put into accelerators and so forth, but not quite systematic enough. But the new thing, and the thing that I'm noticing this time around is that there are a number of programs in several countries specifically aimed at helping their entrepreneurs go global. One that's quite well known is in Japan, called the Shido or Leadership Program, where they are putting a lot of money, government money, into helping startup companies be pitching to foreign investors and being more attractive to foreign investors. Mentoring is not as well developed in Asian startups. I think that in East Asia, you're still dealing with a legacy of Confucianism, the apprentice approach, where, you know, being able to kind of debate and discuss things is not always socially acceptable. Maybe the board management relations in Asian startups are less controversial, less confrontational than they are here, which might feel better, but it may not be the best thing for the startup company. And one other thing about idea knowledge flow is that in the B2B space, it seems to be harder to get into the market, to sell to the big firms in Asia than it is here. One reason is because the big Asia firms are so comfortable with how the market is divided up now. They tend to keep startup company ideas over to the side. They'll do POC hell, right, where a company does demonstration after demonstration, and they keep getting money for the next demonstration, but they never really get adopted by one of the business units. I think that this is dangerous for the big companies in Asia because they will be disrupted by a startup company from outside their industry. Most disruption of existing business comes from outside an industry. And the American companies are very actively working with startup companies in order to not be disrupted. So I think that this kind of thing in the knowledge flow, you have some difficulty. And finally, we get to capital flow. So some things are universal. Starting with your own money and friends and family money is going to be the way it works everywhere. Angel investing used to be a big bottleneck in Asia, but it's gradually easing up. I'm seeing noticeable communities of successful entrepreneurs gathering to either formally make angel investment funds or be more active as individual angel investors and talk to each other. The venture capital investments have been tracking the global patterns, meaning they're going down. Fewer deals and smaller deal sizes mean that the startup valuations are lower, which is a problem if you're a startup, but for the system, it's probably a good thing. The valuations of startup companies had really spiked up in 2020 and 2021, and they needed to calm down a little bit. So the other pattern that was mentioned by a number of the different sources that I looked at is that the early stage investing seems to be the most healthy right now in this kind of weird period. That it's really the late stage, the follow-on investments that the venture investors are more unwilling to do. They're looking for new opportunities. Maybe they see the next year or two as very uncertain. And a later stage investment is going to be very dependent on the market this year, next year, and the year after. Whereas an early stage, if you need a few more months in technology development, maybe that will be okay, because by the time this company is ready for the market's ready for the company. I do see noticeable influence from Silicon Valley still. We'll talk more about this in the slide in just a minute. Some startup cultures really seem to be moving more and more toward the Silicon Valley pattern. I think that's fine as long as they're not trying to copy Silicon Valley. Every place has its unique kind of culture and what you do in order to create some change, which is what a startup does. It's a change that ripples through the whole water of the economy, has to work for that culture. The biggest differences between Asia and the US is probably in the exit company. I've mentioned, that 90% of Silicon Valley exits are by acquisition. In South Korea and in Japan, it's still exactly the flip. 85 to 90% of exits are by IPO. There's a lot of variation among different investors in different parts of Asia as to what is an appropriate size of the company for exit, how much should the valuation of the company be before it's ready to exit. So looking country by country, this is what happened in China to venture deals. Yep, dropped like a rock all through the year 2022. That is tracking the world pattern that we saw in that earlier slide. India has a similar pattern, but I want you to notice a difference. This is very similar. It's a huge drop. The big difference between India and China is, look here, before COVID. In India, you're kind of gradually building up to this spike in 2021, but the levels, even down at the end, the last quarter of 2022, are a little bit higher than they were 5 or 6 years ago. Compare that to China. Notice how China had its big heyday in 2018 and then did go down in 2019 and 2020. They were early in their spike, their post-COVID spike, and a big post-COVID spike, and then they've gone down. But as a whole, India shows itself kind of on the way up, whereas China is kind of not really sure what direction it's going. Singapore looks a lot like India. And Singapore is, of course, the investment center for all of Southeast Asia. But before COVID, it really wasn't that big. Then it had this incredible spike. And even in 2022, it stayed quite high. So the emerging market opportunities in Southeast Asia are really looking attractive to a lot of investors. Japan has been kind of actually more or less the same, except for the spike. It's, $800 million invested in Q4 of 2022. The foreign participation is also very different in China than in other places. In China, the percentage of all venture capital deals that had some foreign participation was only 18.6%. Compare that to what's going on in India, where almost every deal has some foreign investors in it. Foreign participation in investments continues to dominate. Now, notice that the one investor group that is not really increasing much in India is China, right? There's not much Chinese investment into India, at least as far as the end of 2021. I couldn't get a more recent version of this chart. Another point that is different, and in this case, Japan is the outlier. In most Asian countries, kind of like worldwide, you have about 10% of all venture capital deals involve what people call strategic investors. These are often corporate venture capital, where corporate usually refers to an operating company, but it can also refer to a financial institution that's investing, for instance, in a technology that it might want to use, not just for financial return. So the big thing about CVC is that the investor is looking for strategic benefit from the investment, whereas the other kinds of venture investors are typically almost all interested in financial return only. So the Asia pattern really tracks the worldwide pattern. So about you know, 3 out of $16 billion was involved corporate venture capital. 417 out of 2,300 deals involved corporate venture capital. Same kind of pattern throughout until you get to Japan, where half of the money invested in corporate venture capital in 2022 Q4 was CVC, and almost a little more than a third of the deals were involving CVC. That's actually a little lower than it used to be. It used to be CVC accounted for 70 or 80% of all of the venture capital investment in Japan. But this shows that the big Japanese companies are using this system in order to be able to innovate. Almost all of the money they're investing goes outside Japan. So there was a 5-year study done by JETRO of CVC investors from Japan in Silicon Valley that found they had done 288 deals and over $28 billion of investments in 5 years. So that averages out to $3 or $4 billion a year. The total amount of venture capital invested in Japan, completely, all, was about the same amount of money. So the big Japanese companies have been very active here in Silicon Valley for years. Unfortunately, with the slowdown in the economy, the unicorn baby boom has ended, right? There was this huge spike in the number of unicorns born, meaning a startup company that reaches $1 billion valuation. And until in Q4 of 2022, only 9 new unicorns were created in the US, and only 2 were created in Asia. So that's something that is definitely trending with the economy. It doesn't necessarily mean that the startup system is dead, though. Exit patterns, what you see is globally about this 10-to-1 ratio, right? 90% of exits will be M&A, and 10% will be 10% will be IPO. Look at Asia, though. What has really happened is that M&A has been dropping and IPO has stayed relatively steady. So that now, really Asia-wide, not just in Japan where it's always been kind of skewed like this, or South Korea, it's always been skewed like this, all across Asia, the number of IPOs is almost as many as the number of M&A, mainly because the big companies just aren't buying. That's probably a characteristic of the economy more than it is a characteristic of the quality of the startups. So that's pretty much the talk for today. Venture funding has slowed down everywhere, but interest in Asia remains strong. We're seeing this kind of growth of an international mindset among entrepreneurs and funding sources in Asia. The digital infrastructure is one big reason behind this, right? Ones and zeros don't know languages, right? And so, it's also driven by interest in solving global problems. One source that I couldn't find when I was putting the slides together today said that all sectors funding were down except for sustainability. And sustainability is actually showing a slight increase in venture capital funding during 2022. And the need for big markets in order to get money from the investors. People in money flow, there's been a noticeable decrease in the entrepreneurship rate in China and an increase at the same time in the United States. You're seeing promotion of tech transfer as pushing startup creation all across Asia. But unfortunately, the business knowledge is not getting to the founding teams as much as it needs to. The venture capital industry across major Asia economies is more or less converging with the global patterns. Japan is still kind of an outlier in its extreme reliance on corporate venture capital. but most of that's going to foreign investments anyway. And the exit patterns tend to differ. You tend to get longer-term incubation and longer-term relationships in Asia than you do in the United States, which is not a surprise. We've got a very liquid labor market where it's highly mobile. And so exit does not necessarily mean the end of your career. It's the opening of the next opportunity. So I'm very excited to see people who are talking to us from the front lines of these different economies. I hope you can come back and be with us or join us by Zoom at this time. It's completely open, and we welcome all participation. But that's my talk for today. Why don't we call an end to the formal part? If you've got questions or comments, Brianna will have a microphone. Let's help the people on Zoom by making sure you wait for the microphone to get to you. Thanks for your attention. Let's go to Q&A. Does any of this not match? We've got visitors from a lot of different countries here today. Does any of this not match the way things feel in your country? Because maybe you're right. I'm looking at what people are putting into the numbers, but how do things feel in these different entrepreneurial ecosystems? Go ahead.
Hi, sir. I'm from China, and I honestly there was a slide about B2B model doesn't work in Asia except China. I just feel like one of my friends, he works in VC venture capital, and he's told me that B2B model doesn't work in China as well. The corporation in China, they don't pay for this kind of B2B tools, this kind of things. So just want to ask this question.
Of course, China has a really interesting industrial structure. You've got the giant IT firms in China that are as giant as the ones here are. But there's a handful, right? Just like there's a handful here. Then there's a lot of state-owned enterprises or partially state-owned enterprises in more traditional industries. And I think that if you're in China, you're managing flow of knowledge very carefully. The more you open up to partnerships with startup companies and so forth, maybe the startup companies are worried that their ideas will be taken by the big company. Or maybe the big company is just not hungry enough for a new market opportunity it's not doing with its own R&D group. That's also possible. The one thing that I don't think you will get in China yet is a prestige difference, where a big company in some Asian economies will be so proud of being the big prestigious company that the startup company is always sort of, bowing to the floor in front of them. I don't think that's happening in China yet, but I do think that the market opportunities in China are a little bit hard to figure. It's still a place where you have to have really good kind of personal connections to be successful as an entrepreneur. And that kind of thing doesn't lead to good company-to-company relations. That's just my idea. I don't have more data than that, but that's a very good comment. Thank you for sharing that. I think you're right.
Okay, thanks for your answer.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions or comments? Well, okay. Go ahead. I'll leave it to Brianna.
Is there a large difference, do you think, in the industries the startups are operating in between more advanced economies like the US and Southeast Asia? So obviously in Asia you have lower hanging fruit, and you might see industries more traditional industries being digitized first, as opposed to the US where it's more
so that's a very insightful comment. We could do a whole talk on it, because the World Economic Forum divides stages of economic growth, where after being a traditional economy, the first stage of major growth is typically factor-driven, meaning it's driven either by access to some natural resource or cheaper labor. In that kind of an economy, that's when industrialization is really just kicking off. And the type of opportunities that tend to be the very best are opportunities that get to people's daily lives and provide, solutions to needs that have never been met before. The second stage of growth, the World Economic Forum, and this follows a model that originally goes back to Michael Porter. The World Economic Forum calls it efficiency-driven growth. And at efficiency-driven growth, you already have some national scale champion companies who've been very successful, and they've got to continue their growth. And the only way they can continue their growth is by scaling up, often by internationalizing. So they become more efficient at getting bigger. They also become more efficient at getting higher quality. That stage of growth was kind of characteristic of the high level of growth in the United States in the 1950s to 1970s, in Japan from the 1960s until the 1980s, in South Korea from the late 1980s until 2000 or so. At that stage of growth, the best kind of opportunities people can have is something that's going to make business more efficient, right? Or make lifestyles more efficient. It's going to see the growth and income in the country and be able to provide new things to the people that maybe they used to be luxury items, but now people really want them, like televisions and air conditioners. The third stage of growth, according to the World Economic Forum, is innovation driven. By that point, you have really an advanced economy. And education typically has spread through the economy. The factory workers typically want their children to have other jobs, not work in factories. And because of that educational spread, and this has been the hard thing for every economy. In the United States, it goes back to the mid-1980s, maybe actually earlier than that. Maybe it was really more like the 70s. But the best kind of opportunities are brilliant new ideas that just everybody loves. And think about, the Apple iPhone, think about everything that we have that's making our life different now. So right now in Asia, you have advanced economies that are really trying to be innovation driven. So Japan and Korea, and I think to a certain extent, China is still transitional, but probably can be fit into that category where the types of new opportunities will involve more technology. They will involve staying away from the areas in which the big companies are already competitive because there's already a big industrial base. There will be more things that are going to disrupt old ways of doing things. Think about, how cell phones took over from cameras. So that kind of thing is the opportunity in the sort of advanced economy Asia. But in places like Southeast Asia and South Asia, you have so much addressing basic needs that these are huge new middle classes that are forming. And middle classes are really important, not only because they consume a lot more, but because they tend to have a hope for the future. They tend to look for their children to be better off than they were. And so I think that's where the big growth opportunities are happening in Asia. That's a long answer to your question, but all across Asia, you've got different stages of economic growth, and the types of opportunities differ depending on that stage of growth. Thanks for a really good point, really good question. Yeah, let's go here first. I saw your hand first, and then over there.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I was wondering what you think that governments in Asia can do to kind of overcome the Confucian model of information sharing to kind of promote better business practices within the startup culture?
Information sharing or data sharing?
Or more so like passing on knowledge about how to conduct business better?
Yeah. This has actually been kind of a painful process in the US that we tend to forget because we don't pay much attention to it. Silicon Valley is part of a very litigious culture. If you take information that should be confidential to the company and use it in your own startup or you give it to somebody else, you're probably going to get sued. And what has happened over the long term as an outcome of that is that the Silicon Valley networking is very sophisticated in how much it can say about company information. You get this kind of stuff where people just kind of know where's the right point to stop talking. I think that what governments need to do across Asia is make sure that those kind of infringement laws are clear. In China, there are special courts now. This was something that started about 5 years ago to handle IP cases. And the number of IP cases has been going off the chart in China because there's so much intellectual property in China that, now people need to make sure it's protected. That's the stick, right? That's the hard part. I think that bringing people together in groups that they don't usually come together in may be the single most important thing for a government to do. Not to try to tell people how to share information, but to get people all talking about the same problem, whether their background is technology or business or ethics, or what kind of background they have as people. We really have to get the benefits of diversity, not just say how many percentage of a group should be from this particular group. We've got to get the benefits of different points of view. Governments have two concrete tools, regulation and financial incentives. But they also have a function to kind of stir the public sentiment, help people be aware of issues and problems. And that, I think, somewhere in there, within the limitations of what a government can do, because they can't come up with the specific solutions. That's private sector. That's the companies and the other groups that really do innovation and take something all the way to market. But there's certainly a role for the governments in bringing together different groups of people for a common purpose. That might be the very best thing. Also, a really good comment. Thank you. Over here? Yeah.
Firstly, thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. On the slides, we saw that in Indonesia, the rate of female entrepreneurship is higher than that for males, and almost the same in India. Do you think there are any interesting characteristics that come out of this that might shape trends of entrepreneurship in the future in those countries? And conversely, when the rate is double for men than women in South Korea, how may that impact things?
First of all, I'm still trying to figure out why those numbers are there. I'm rather surprised. But it could be that women have some sort of a proximity to the opportunities that men are missing in those societies. Or maybe the labor market has been so much trying to get men into the regular jobs that there's more opportunities for women to be entrepreneurs because the existing institutions aren't accepting them. That's also possible. I think that the more women you get into an economy, the better you can deal with your stage of economic growth and moving to the next stage, especially in an innovation-driven economy. If everybody looks at the problem from the same background, you don't usually get interesting solutions. And so I think that this is going to be not only important for a country like Japan or China, where the population's shrinking and they desperately need people to fill up the economy. And here's a huge group of people underutilized in the economy. It's not just that, it's the quality of the innovation that can happen. So I'm positive on that. I think that this is one of those things where people have to do it. And those that get it right will be the early winners. So, I look forward to seeing what happens from here. Other questions? Back in the back. Yep. Oh, who's got the mic? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you had the mic. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that like entrepreneurs in Asia tend to stay with their company after exit.
Yeah.
And there's like longer term relationships. So why is that the case compared to like the rest of the world?
I think it's best for me to put it in metaphorical terms. To people in Asia, starting a company is a little bit like giving birth to a child. And so that's your child, and you don't want to sell it to somebody, for pity's sake. However, another way of looking at it would be if the child is growing up and the natural thing to do is for them to get married and start another family, then that's kind of the attitude that we tend to have here. If you start a company, you really need to be prepared for, typically, the time to exit here in the States is about 6.5 years, unless it's medical, in which the time to exit may be more like 10 to 12 years. But sometime around then, and you need to plan on following through after that with the company for a couple of years. So you really need to make a 10-year commitment to your company. I think that to some extent, the situation in some countries also reflects a previous path for company creation that's very different from the kind of innovation economy Silicon Valley model. So in Japan, the big keiretsu, the business groups, have always actually been very dynamic in terms of creating new companies to take care of new business opportunities, because the new business opportunity will have its own P&L, profit and loss responsibility, early, and that prevents the other companies in the group from having to take the risk, right? They create this new company, and if it doesn't work, it just sort of goes away in a couple of years. But it's once in 40 or 50 years would one of these companies formed inside a business group become the center of the business group. That rarely happens. Most of the time they stay in niche markets because they're afraid of disrupting the business of other companies in the group. The only time you see that kind of thing really leading to a giant company was the disappearance of the textile industry in Japan in the 1920s. At that point, the automobile industry was starting to pick up worldwide, and a lot of foreign companies came in and did joint ventures with Japanese companies that later became the core of Toyota. Started out that way. Suzuki started out that way. That kind of thing is where the first Toyota company was making an automated loom, not an automobile. So you do have exceptions, but most of the time it's just kind of fear of disruption, fear of taking away what the existing companies and the other companies in the group already have. Excellent questions. I have time for one more. I'll try.
So something that I noticed in the slides is that for all countries, there's been a dips in funding over the previous year. But something that I have noticed, I'm from Australia, is that the drop in funding has asymmetrically impacted growth stage round, so your Series A's, B's, and C's, significantly more than seed stage, where it's more,
Right.
it's been quite resilient. My question is, have you noticed that this trend is region agnostic, that this affects all regions or specific regions more than others?
I actually think it's pretty region agnostic, partly because the investors, most of them are thinking across borders in Asia. And so they influence each other. And also, the kind of psychological reasons not to invest in a growth round don't really depend on national conditions or on culture. So I tend to think that that's something going on all over the place. It's not too dissimilar from what's happening here. You're seeing, it's harder to get money now than it was. But of course, everybody says that if you wait a few years, you'll see some of the great companies of the 2030s started right now. And that's probably true if you can be one of those companies and make it last. So that's a great question, great comment. Thank you. And thanks again, everybody. We've got some refreshments. Great. So we'll continue our discussion outside with refreshments. For now, we'll close the meeting off, and thanks again for your participation.